The real story of enslaved people's resistance beyond rebellion. What if the greatest resistance movement in American history was never recorded? What if their secrets were hidden in plain sight? Until now, Dr. Lillian Carter thought she was just uncovering old letters. But what she found was a forgotten war, a network so powerful it threatened those in control. And now, someone is watching her. This isn't just history, it's a battle that never ended. Stay with me as we reveal the truth they never wanted us to know. Part 1. The Forbidden Letters. Dr. Lillian Carter had spent countless hours in archives before, but something about the dimly lit basement of the St. Augustine University Library unsettled her. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of aging paper, the kind of place where forgotten history waited to be rediscovered. The flickering fluorescent light above her cast long, eerie shadows over the rows of wooden shelves packed with brittle, time-worn documents. She was here on a routine research trip, combing through antebellum records for a new article, until her fingers brushed against something odd. A small, worn leather case, wedged between two crumbling volumes, so out of place it stopped her breath. It was bound shut with a delicate but frayed silk ribbon, and as she carefully untied it, a set of folded letters spilled onto the desk in front of her. The parchment was old, edges browned with time, but what caught her attention was the handwriting, elegant but deliberately obscured, lines of text broken by strange symbols and faint smudges of what might have once been wax seals. Her pulse quickened. At first glance, the letters seemed like ordinary correspondence from the 19th century, but something felt off. Phrases repeated in unnatural patterns, names were omitted, and certain words were written in a different hand, as though someone had tried to hide messages within messages. She adjusted her reading glasses and carefully unfolded the top letter, her heart pounding as she scanned the contents. What she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't just a letter, it was a cipher. Someone long ago had gone to great lengths to conceal whatever this was. And more importantly, who had hidden it in a forgotten corner of the archive, waiting for the right person to find it? As she leaned in closer, tracing the inked words with her fingertips, she suddenly felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. Part 2. The Ghost of the Past. Lillian barely slept that night. The letters haunted her, their cryptic messages pressing on her mind like whispered secrets begging to be unraveled. She spread them across her desk, cross-referencing every name, every unusual phrase. The patterns were there, deliberate, hidden in plain sight. Hours turned into days as she combed through plantation records, abolitionist writings, and obscure personal accounts. Then, at 3:47 a.m., eyes bleary from exhaustion, she found him. Benji Gaines. The name appeared again and again in reports from the 1850s, always in the margins, always just out of focus. A skilled carpenter by trade, Benji was enslaved on the vast Everly plantation, but his story didn't end there. He was mentioned in estate ledgers with peculiar frequency, often traveling between plantations at a time when movement was tightly restricted. There were rumors in old abolitionist correspondences, references to a silent hand orchestrating disruptions, smuggling intelligence, and arranging escapes so elaborate they defied logic. Benji Gaines hadn't just been a runaway or a rebel. He had been a strategist, a ghost within the system. And then he vanished. No records of his death. No documentation of a sale or escape. Just gone. Lillian's fingers trembled as she typed his name into a genealogy database. A single living descendant popped up, Marcus Gaines, age 63. A retired history teacher living in Baton Rouge. Her heart pounded as she reached for the phone. The first call went to voicemail. The second rang endlessly before cutting off. Finally, she sent an email, introducing herself and explaining, carefully, that she had uncovered something linked to his ancestor. She waited. No response. The next morning, she tried again. This time, his number was disconnected. Unease settled in her stomach. Determined, she booked a flight and drove straight to the last address listed on record, a modest brick home nestled between towering oaks. The front door was slightly ajar. She hesitated. A single step forward, and she could see inside. Papers scattered on the floor. The couch overturned. The unmistakable scent of stale coffee abandoned mid-brew. Marcus Gaines was gone. And someone had gotten here first. Part 3. The Silent Enemy. Lillian sat in her dimly lit hotel room, staring at her laptop screen. The cursor blinked over the last email she had sent to Marcus Gaines. An email that would never be answered. The house. The mess. The absence of any sign of struggle, yet an undeniable sense that someone had swept through, erasing traces of him. She took a deep breath, determined to push forward. But as she reached for her notes, her phone vibrated. No caller ID. She hesitated before answering. A silence stretched on the other end, thick and unnatural, like someone was there, listening. Then a whisper. A distorted voice just above a breath. Some stories should stay buried. The line went dead. Lillian's skin prickled. A chill crept up her spine. Had she imagined it? Maybe she was sleep-deprived, too deep in her research, too caught up in the weight of what she had uncovered. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the unease curling in her chest. But the next morning it got worse. She returned to her office at the university to find her desk drawers hanging open, their contents rifled through. Stacks of papers that had been meticulously organized were now in disarray. Her laptop sat in the center, screen still on, a single document open. A document she hadn't opened. A message typed in the center of a blank page. "Stop digging." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, scanning the empty room, the hushed silence pressing down on her. The security cameras in the hallway, were they working? Would they even reveal anything? As she reached for her phone, a realization hit her like ice water. This wasn't random. Whoever had been in her office didn't just want to scare her. They knew exactly what she was working on. They knew exactly what she had found. And worst of all, they were close. Someone within her circle. A colleague? A friend? The enemy wasn't in the shadows anymore. They were watching. Part 4. The Network Awakens. Lillian sat in the university archives, surrounded by a fortress of books, maps, and scattered notes. Her hands trembled as she traced the inked symbols in the old letters, connecting dots that had been hidden for centuries. It wasn't just Benji Gaines. There were others. She shuffled through the documents, heart pounding. The Underground Railroad was only one layer of the resistance. Beneath it, woven into the very fabric of 19th century society, was something much larger, a network operating in plain sight but invisible to history books. A war. The letters hinted at coded messages concealed in mundane transactions, shipments that never arrived, businesses that mysteriously collapsed, supplies that were lost but never recovered. Slave uprisings weren't always spontaneous. They were often orchestrated. Information moved through unexpected channels. Tailors who sewed messages into the linings of coats. Washerwomen who whispered battle plans as they scrubbed blood from their masters' clothes. And it went even higher. Some of the names buried in the letters sent a shiver down her spine. Wealthy abolitionists weren't just donors. Some were operatives, hiding fugitives not out of charity, but as part of a coordinated intelligence effort. Ministers turned their pulpits into war rooms. Even a handful of plantation owners, secret sympathizers, had provided cover for escapees in ways that defied everything Lillian thought she knew. This was no isolated rebellion. This was an insurgency. And the final piece fell into place when she found the list. It wasn't just names. It was locations. Safe houses. Meeting points. Codes disguised as purchase orders, cryptic references to supply routes, and a network that stretched from the deep south to the highest echelons of northern society. Some of the locations were familiar, others were missing, erased, as if someone had gone to great lengths to wipe them from history. Lillian exhaled sharply. If this network had survived as long as it had, if it had adapted and shifted under the weight of oppression, could it still exist? As she stared at the documents before her, a creeping thought chilled her blood. Maybe the network had never truly died. Maybe it had just gone silent. And now, because of her discovery, it was waking up. Part 5. The Modern Profiteers. Lillian's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her pulse hammering in her ears. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became, this wasn't just history. It was business. The network she had uncovered, the secret war of resistance. It hadn't just been erased from history. It had been exploited. At first, the connections seemed circumstantial, old plantation owners who shifted their wealth into early banking institutions, slave traders who rebranded as industrialists after the Civil War, railroads that had suspicious ties to missing abolitionist figures. But when she cross-referenced them with modern corporations, her stomach twisted. Insurance companies that had once profited from insuring enslaved lives still existed. Different names, different branding, but the same blood-soaked foundation. Private prisons, their structures eerily similar to the work camps of the 19th century, funneled black bodies into a new form of bondage. Even powerful political dynasties, their wealth dating back generations, had roots in the suppression of the very resistance she was uncovering. And then she found the ledger. It had been buried in a digitized archive, mislabeled, nearly impossible to find. A simple financial record from 1856, but beneath its mundane exterior was something far more chilling. Payments. Line after line of transactions. Not just for enslaved labor, but for something else. Bounties. Hush money to silence abolitionists. Bribes to infiltrate and dismantle resistance cells. Funds funneled into newspapers that rewrote history, erasing the full scope of defiance and painting the enslaved as docile, passive, or eternally grateful for their so-called emancipation. And then, at the bottom of the ledger, one final transaction. A payout, vast, staggering, enough to build an empire. The recipient? A name she recognized instantly, because his family still existed, and they were still in power. Lillian's breath hitched as she leaned back in her chair, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating the horror dawning on her face. This wasn't just about history. This was about now, and someone had gotten away with it. Part 6. The Betrayal Within. Lillian could barely process the words flashing across the screen. Dr. Carter's research is built on flimsy speculation and misinterpretation of historical records. No credible historian supports her conspiracy-laden claims. Reckless, dishonest, dangerous. The article was everywhere. Major news outlets, academic blogs, even social media. The source? Dr. Samuel Everett. Her partner, her colleague. The person who had sat beside her for months, sorting through archives, debating theories, connecting the pieces. Had she missed the signs? Heart-pounding, she dialed his number. Straight to voicemail. She tried again, and again. Finally, she drove to his apartment. The door opened just a crack, revealing Samuel's face, drawn, pale, his eyes shadowed with something unreadable. "Lillian, you need to stop." His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. She shoved the door wider. "You wrote that article. You, Samuel, you know the truth. You've seen the evidence. How could you?" He flinched. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." Silence. Then, finally, he exhaled, his gaze darting past her as if someone might be watching. "They came to me," he murmured. "First, it was an email, then a phone call, and then He swallowed hard. I got a package. It had my sister's address, my mother's hospital records, my bank transactions from 10 years ago. Lillian's blood ran cold. They said if I didn't discredit you, they'd ruin everything. That was the best outcome, Lillian. The other things they hinted at. He broke off, rubbing his hands over his face. I didn't have a choice. Lillian took a step back, as if the weight of his words had physically struck her. Her own research had led her here. Her own discoveries had made her a target. And now, Samuel, her friend, had been used to destroy her credibility before she could expose the truth. Who are they? She whispered. His lips pressed into a thin line. He shook his head. I don't know. But Lillian, his voice trembled. They're bigger than you think. A shiver ran down her spine. She had been betrayed, but not by Samuel, by something much larger. And if they were willing to turn her closest ally against her, how far would they go to stop her next? Part 7. The Hidden Map. The candlelight flickered against the old parchment as Lillian traced the faded ink with her fingertip. The letters had led her here, to this brittle, time-worn map buried in the archives of a long-forgotten abolitionist estate. At first glance, it was just an ordinary 19th century map of the South. Rivers, roads, towns, plantations. Nothing remarkable. But then she saw it. A tiny mark, so faint it was almost invisible, near the banks of a river that no longer existed on modern maps. She grabbed her notebook, flipping back through the letters, her pulse quickening. The resistance leaders had mentioned it again and again. Where the water bends, the truth remains. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a poetic phrase. It was directions. She pulled up a digital overlay of modern topography, running calculations, aligning the old river paths with current maps. And then there it was. A location deep in the woods of Mississippi. No marked roads. No structures. Nothing. A place that shouldn't exist. Yet the letters spoke of it as something monumental. A meeting ground, a sanctuary, a vault where crucial documents were hidden, proof of the resistance's full scale. If she found it, she could uncover evidence no one had ever seen before. But her elation was short-lived. Her laptop screen flickered. A strange pop-up appeared, an unfamiliar symbol. Then the screen went black. Someone had hacked her. Her phone buzzed. A new email. No subject line, no sender. Just a single sentence. Walk away, Dr. Carter. The breath left her lungs. She wasn't the only one searching for the hidden meeting place. And whoever they were already watching her. Part 8. The deadly discovery. The trees loomed like silent sentinels as Lillian pushed through the undergrowth, her flashlight cutting through the suffocating darkness. The old map had led her here, deep into the Mississippi wilderness, far from any marked roads or signs of civilization. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for. A buried chest? A forgotten structure? Some kind of marker left behind by those who had fought and died for a history no one wanted told? Her boots crunched over damp leaves as she scanned the area. The air smelled of moss and earth, thick with the weight of centuries. Then she saw it. Half hidden beneath tangled vines stood the remains of a stone foundation, too deliberate to be natural. A structure had once been here. Heart pounding, she knelt, brushing dirt away from the crumbling stone. There were carvings, symbols she had seen in the letters. This was it. A wave of triumph surged through her, before an unmistakable sound shattered the silence. A twig snapping. Lillian froze. She wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned her head. A shadow moved between the trees, too controlled to be an animal. Someone was watching her. She scrambled to her feet, backing toward the ruined foundation, her mind racing. Had they followed her from the moment she left? Or had they been waiting for her all along? Then, a voice, low, calm, and terrifying in its certainty. "You shouldn't have come here, Dr. Carter." A figure stepped forward, half hidden by the darkness. Lillian's breath caught as she recognized him. Not a stranger, not an anonymous threat. Someone she had seen before. Someone connected to the very institutions she had been investigating. The resistance hadn't just been fighting slavery. They had been fighting something larger. And that fight? It wasn't over. Part 9. The ultimate cover-up. Lillian's pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the man in front of her, the shadowed figure who had been watching her, hunting her. She knew his face. He wasn't just some nameless operative. He was tied to one of the very institutions that had tried to bury the truth. A professor, a historian, a well-respected figure who had, until now, played the role of an ally. "You don't understand what you've uncovered," he said, his voice smooth, measured. "And if you try to expose it, you won't just ruin your career. You'll destroy everything." Lillian swallowed hard. The letters, the resistance, they weren't just fighting slavery, were they? Her voice wavered, but she didn't back down. They were fighting something that's still here. "You're still here." He sighed, as if disappointed. "You think history is just a record of the past?" "No, Dr. Carter. It's a weapon. And those who control it, control everything." A cold chill swept over her. Slavery wasn't just about labor, he continued. It was about power, control. The economy, politics, even the legal system, they were all part of something bigger. And when the resistance threatened that structure, it wasn't just erased. He stepped closer. It was rewritten. Lillian's mind reeled. The centuries of misinformation, the sanitized history lessons, the deliberate omission of enslaved people's intelligence networks, economic sabotage, and coordinated uprisings. The way the narrative had been reshaped to make resistance seem rare, isolated, hopeless. A lie. A carefully crafted, systemic, intentional lie. "You think exposing this will change things?" The man shook his head. "You don't know the forces you're up against. This isn't just about history books. It's about wealth, power, entire industries built on the backs of the erased." Lillian took a step back. "You can't stop the truth from coming out." He gave her a long, pitying look. "Haven't we?" And then, a sharp rustle in the woods. A second figure emerging. Footsteps behind her. Lillian's breath hitched. She was surrounded. She had thought she was uncovering the past, but she had walked straight into a war that had never ended. And the final part, the shocking finale. Lillian stood frozen, her breath shallow as the circle of shadows closed in. The man before her, once a respected historian, now revealed as a guardian of a centuries-old conspiracy, tilted his head, studying her as if waiting for her to accept defeat. "You could have walked away," he said, "but now you leave us no choice." Lillian clenched her fists. No choice? The very words echoed the lies enslaved people had been told for generations. That resistance was impossible, that the system was too strong to fight. But the letters had proved otherwise. And if history had been rewritten before, she could rewrite it again. A sudden noise shattered the tension, a deep, resonating boom. Not a gunshot, something else. The unmistakable roar of an explosion. Flames burst into the sky from somewhere beyond the trees, illuminating the night in a fiery orange glow. Chaos erupted. Shouts, confusion, her captors scrambled, their attention momentarily broken. Lillian took her chance, lunging backward into the darkness. A hand grabbed her wrist. She gasped, then realized it wasn't one of them. It was him, the man who had vanished, the last known descendant of the enslaved strategist, the one she had spent weeks searching for. "You're not alone," he whispered. "You never were." Before she could respond, he pulled her forward, leading her through the chaos as figures emerged from the woods. Activists, journalists, hackers, people who had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And this was it. The truth was no longer trapped in letters or buried in forgotten ruins. It had already been sent, uploaded, published. The centuries-long cover-up was unraveling in real time. Names, documents, financial records linking modern institutions to the old slave economy, to the suppression of resistance, to the rewriting of history. The story was already out. The people trying to silence her? They were too late. Lillian turned back one last time, locking eyes with the man who had tried to stop her. For the first time, he looked afraid. She had won, but at what cost? As the fires burned behind her, as the weight of everything she had uncovered settled onto her shoulders, she knew one thing for certain. History wasn't just a battlefield. It was a war that had never ended. And now, the whole world could see it. What if the greatest acts of resistance were never recorded? Not because they were lost, but because someone made sure we'd never find them. Dr. Carter thought she was chasing history, but history was chasing her back. If the truth had been buried for over a century, what else is still hidden in the shadows? And more importantly, who's still trying to keep it that way? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories.